Centerview is a private, small investment bank. Investment banks do two things really, for those of you who aren't familiar with it. One is they help businesses do transactions, buying things, selling things, mergers, acquisitions. They deal with special situations when, for example, a corporate, someone goes on the board and challenges the leadership. They get involved in all those things. And then increasingly strategic advice for CEOs and companies. I'm useful because I don't see how you could be a CEO anymore and not think about the world, markets, supply chains, what have you, but also not think about regulatory issues. Whether it's the US government, there's this new thing called a tariff, or sanctions, or the various types of regulatory policy. So in addition to the sorts of transactions that investment bankers are associated with, increasingly you see people like me at virtually all these firms who are giving geopolitical advice to companies. It's, for better or worse, it's now, I think, pretty essential.
Wonderful. So geopolitical advice. I'd like to start from a piece of news that has, that has arrived as a bombshell on Wall Street, and the fact that all of a sudden we've discovered that China was quite ahead in artificial intelligence, and DeepSeek, the new artificial intelligence tool from China. Most of you must have seen that yesterday NVIDIA has lost $600 billion of capitalization on the stock exchange.
They gained some of it back today.
Tiny, I think 0.2%. Yes, exactly. So the market is still very worried, and I think that this is a very interesting news, because so far we sort of regarded China as a political competitor of the US, with the alliance that is doing with Russia and so on and so forth. Military competitor, Taiwan, and the build up in Asia, and we thought that maybe they were a little behind on the high tech, but now it seems that they're not, and in fact this new tool seems to have been put at the defensive everybody. So how does this fit into the geopolitical, economic, and artificial intelligence, the tool of the future?
Let me just say one thing about it. Having experimented with it a little bit, it's quite extraordinary. And its ability to reason, to the logic, strength, it's really quite an extraordinary tool as these things go. What makes it truly, though, important, what I was getting at, was that it was developed with relatively little money, $6 million or something. Supposedly, this is a little matter of some controversy, it's not using the most advanced chips. It took less time to develop than some other things. It requires less energy. So essentially what it does is it upends or challenges almost all the assumptions that Silicon Valley has been operating on, not just NVIDIA, but everybody else. And what I think it says is that China is right there with the United States and others, that all the economic sanctions and export controls and everything else have not succeeded, in particularly the export controls, and that we're going to live in a world in which AI will proliferate. We have to assume that AI will be developed in any number of places, in any number of countries, because the cost has come down and the breakthroughs are coming faster. A lot of these are now open source. So we had this idea that it would be just the United States against China and somehow we could protect our lead. Not gonna happen. Not gonna happen. It's much more of a decentralized world. People think of this as the new nuclear weapon. It's not. When nuclear weapons were developed, or initially it was just the United States and the Soviet Union, large projects. What we're seeing now is lots of countries are gonna be able to develop this, and it's going to be a large number of small projects. So this is much more decentralized. As a result, efforts to control it, I think, are not going to work. Anyone here from the EU ought to take that to heart. The whole approach in Europe, which is much more regulatory as opposed to developmental, seems to me exactly backwards. All that's going to do is guarantee that Europe will have no part of this. And I think those who worry that they may be right, there's negative as well as positive implications of this, but I think it's going to be almost impossible to simply encourage the positive and discourage the negative. Again, too much AI happening too quickly, too inexpensive, in too many hands. So this will affect virtually everything from the economics to personal issues to business issues to strategic issues. I spent some time with it yesterday. It is breathtaking what it can do. And I've been somewhat skeptical of a lot of the claims that have been made about AI. I am no longer skeptical.
So we've seen that there was an interesting reaction by President Trump on this. There was also a reaction by Josh Kushner, who is indirectly related to Trump.
Jared Kushner.
No, Josh the brother.
Oh, Josh.
Josh, who has Thrive Capital
who runs Thrift.
and has collected, has helped to raise $6 billion to invest into OpenAI, and immediately came up this morning or yesterday saying, that China, as usual, has tricked the U.S., has used chips that they were not supposed to have. They as usual, they copied the U.S. and something should be done against it. But the reaction of Trump, which we have seen is usually very harsh on these issues, was, well, our high-tech companies better take notice and go back to work. So, how do you put this?
Mr. Kushner, you're right, the one who runs Thrive. Look, people like him have made enormous investments in AI based on certain assumptions. Those assumptions have been shown to be wrong. The value of those investments today is not what it was 2 days ago. So I would simply, I would just posit.
Excuse me, let me interject with something. How is it possible that in a world where information is all around and everyone knows everything, that nobody knew that China was coming up with this?
The answer is, it's not that they didn't know. Information is only as good as your receptivity to it. If you have an assumption that nothing that comes out of China can be competitive, no matter how much information you receive, you will discount that information. This is when I was in government, often the most important thing was what we would call mindset. Iraq does have weapons of mass destruction. If you think Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, every piece of intelligence you receive confirms that bias. So if Iraq isn't cooperating with the UN inspectors, that means they're hiding their weapons. Turns out Iraq wasn't cooperating with the inspectors because they were hiding the fact they didn't have the weapons. They didn't want to look weak. So if you have certain views about China when it comes to AI, you will discount anything that is inconsistent with those views. This shows to some extent the mindset, some would say arrogance, whatever words you want to use. But there was only one way to do this, which was the way of Silicon Valley. And what we've now learned is there's another way, and this is revolutionary. For that, what I think Mr. Trump's reaction is, the more important reaction here, is quite revealing. Donald Trump actually takes a much more nuanced view of China than probably anybody else in his administration. If you look at how he's gone back and forth on TikTok, that is quite revealing. His desire to meet with Xi Jinping. Donald Trump does not exclude the possibility that the United States and China find areas to cooperate. He doesn't like certain things about China, for example, the trade imbalance, so he'll be attracted to tariffs. But there's other aspects of China that I think he's willing to work with. And so there's those in the administration who see China as simply an economic threat. This will reinforce that. There's those in the administration who see China solely or principally as a geopolitical threat. South China Sea, help for Russia and Ukraine, obviously Taiwan. I think Mr. Trump sees China more through an economic lens than a geopolitical lens. And I think he sees it not simply as an enemy, he sees it as a competitor. But for him, everybody's a competitor. Italy's a competitor, Germany's a competitor, everybody's a competitor. It doesn't matter whether you're an ally or not. So he sees China as another competitor, and no more, no less.
And so within the more general context, you just, it's very interesting about Trump having these nuances. But just a few days ago, China said that it was going to sign off a much stronger alliance with Russia. Yeah. Also, Trump has a view that sometimes that, we've heard him talk about it, that the international organization are totally useless, like even the UN, that the American bases abroad are a waste of money, and so on and so forth. So do you see that there is a risk in Trump taking this approach that is very personal in the relationship with countries, that then he ignores some very important fundamental aspects that are crucial for the future and the security of the United States, like American bases abroad, for example?
Well, I don't think he's against American bases abroad. I've never seen evidence of that. He does have, though, what's commonly described as a transactional view of relations with other countries. And if they're allies, historically, we have not viewed allies, for the most part, transactionally. We thought they were necessary, helping, we would help them, not simply to help them. The United States historically, for example, is in Europe after World War II, not simply to help Europe, but we understood that helping Europe was good for us. I'm not sure Mr. Trump necessarily sees it that way. I think he mainly sees what the United States does in Europe is good for Europe, which is why he expects Europe to do more, pay more for that benefit. I think, like a lot of presidents, he has a personalistic approach to foreign policy. In my experience, almost every president places too much emphasis on his personal relationship with foreign leaders. In my own view, it doesn't count for that. Count for that much. But yeah, but I do think he has a more skeptical view of a lot of the basic tenets or shibboleths of American foreign policy that have shaped American foreign policy now for what, 75, 80 years. I think he's much more skeptical about the value of alliances. He's obviously very skeptical of the value of trade. He's skeptical of multilateral institutions. By the way, I am skeptical of many of them too. If you're not skeptical of the United Nations, you're not a serious person. Of course you've got to be skeptical of the United Nations. But that's just he's skeptical also, by the way, I think, of the use of military force. So Donald Trump, I spent 20 years at the Council on Foreign Relations. I don't think Mr. Trump, shall we say, bought into a lot of the assumptions or premises that a lot of people who were members of the Council on Foreign Relations tend to.
Okay, this brings us back to what I was saying when we saw each other, about 20 years ago, and you were writing the new.
When we both had more hair.
Well, we're both back, exactly, more hair and darker hair, I would say. But so that you were writing the new, foreign policy, the new order, let's say, that the U.S. should have had in order to approach the future. But it was starting from some foundations that one way or another had guaranteed the security of the United States. As you say, after 70 years, Trump may change completely. How far do you think he can go in changing the fundamental platform, and what kind of danger is implicit into that?
I can't tell you how far he will go because I don't have a crystal ball. It's not for me, conversations about what Donald Trump will do are not very interesting because the answer is, I don't know, you don't know, and I'm not even sure he knows in every case. So let's just posit that. How far he can go is very far. If you look at the American political system, you look at the Constitution, you look at the last 80 years of history, presidents have enormous discretion, enormous latitude when it comes to foreign policy. They can do just about anything they want. Many cases they don't require congressional approval. If Donald Trump tomorrow wants to give a speech raising fundamental questions, I'm not saying he will, but if he wanted to, about Article 5, he'll do it. Congress won't stop it. Just this week, what did he do? He ordered a pause, quote unquote, in all U.S. foreign aid with very few exceptions. My point is simply that if he wants to use military force, the United States has used military force hundreds of times since World War II. Only about 5 or 6 times did Congress actually give a formal authorization. Only once or twice was there a declaration of war. So Congress is essential when it comes to certain types of spending, traditionally to approve aid, to approve the military defense spending. Obviously it has to confirm his cabinet choices. But even if they refuse to confirm, say, his cabinet choices, he could make somebody acting for quite a while. My point is simply that presidents have enormous discretion, and Donald Trump exercises more discretion than most presidents. He is not bound by what you'd say are by the norms of American political history. So to answer your question, he can do quite a lot. I think in many cases it would be of questionable wisdom if he were to, because I think this world has served us pretty well for the last 75, 80 years. I actually think when historians write about it, they will treat this as something of a golden age of history. If you look at what's happened over the last 75, 80 years, we did not have a great power war. Show me another time that was avoided. The average wealth in the world went up astronomically, orders of magnitude. The average person lives decades longer. More countries are democratic, more individuals have a degree of freedom, et cetera, et cetera. Not bad, not bad. After World War II, all these former colonies became independent. This has been an extraordinary period of history, and my view is, it's not so much if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There's parts of it that are broken, but you never want to fix something more than it's broke. So, or if you're gonna jettison this, you want to be sure you've got something better in its place. And I have yet to see somebody articulate something that is both fundamentally different and fundamentally better.
So something that he is insisting on changing in terms of contribution is NATO. And NATO, of course, has served the US interest very well. No, it's certainly part of. So, A, do you fear that Trump may actually do something strange with NATO? And B, this request of 5%, moving from the 2% contribution, which is already harder to meet for some European countries, to move it to 5%, is just transactional, as you were saying before? Is it real? Is it to push Europe to be much more on its own?
The answer is, it's clearly to push Europe to do much more. Whether 5% is a magic number or just an opening bid, and if Europe got to say 3%, that would be a significant increase and significant accomplishment. And let me just say, he's right. Europe should do much more. There's no justification for Europe not spending much more on its defense. Let me say two things. One is, the United States, yeah, right now we're focused on Russia, but we have global concerns. Europe's just one of them. And as we look at the 21st century, most strategists would say the so-called Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific, is where most of 21st century history is going to be written, not in Europe. If I were a European, I would be asking myself, how do we become more self-sufficient? That goes way beyond Donald Trump. That would have been true had Kamala Harris won. Europeans have been living in a world that is unsustainable. They've got to spend more. Second of all, they've got to spend smarter. The bigger problem of Europe's defense is not that Europeans are not spending enough. That's true, particularly the Germans. The bigger problem of European defense is they're not spending smart enough. Europe spends several $100 billion a year, several $100 billion euros on defense. The result is much less than that. Why? Because most defense spending is determined nationally. Europe doesn't have a collective European approach to defense. What we need is European defense. Instead, we have Italian defense, German defense, French defense, British defense, this defense, that defense. Too many budgets are determined nationally. There's way too much duplication and not nearly enough collective effort and specialization. So what the Europeans should do is, yes, spend more. But even more important, they should spend smarter. And that's something Europeans control. And the problem, therefore, is European, not American.
So,
and by the way, I'm like one of the traditional friends of Europe. So when I say things like that, not that I'm important, but Europeans should take it seriously. They've got a real problem. And the idea when you say, Mario, that it's very hard politically for several European countries to spend more, too bad. Either spend more, spend smarter, or live with the consequences.
So that's a very good point. And in fact, when we started the conversation, we discussed China, Russia, and US, and not Europe. So do you think that Europe may understand, and what do you think of the Draghi report for that matter? Was it too little too late? Or Europe has some possibility, if it gets its act together, to become one of the players?
Look, the problem with the Draghi report is not the Draghi report. Virtually everything Mario does is good. The problem with the Draghi report is it's not going to be implemented. It's going to remain a report rather than reality. I'd much rather have the Draghi reality, and I don't see that happening. So that's again a challenge for Europe, and we'll see if it's up to the challenge, but I'm skeptical. Europe seems to me right now quite parochial. And if I were a European, look at the handwriting on the wall. Europe's share of global GDP has gone from what, roughly 25% to between what, 10 and 15%. That should tell you something. Where's most of the innovation happening? It ain't happening in Europe. We just began the conversation talking about America and China on AI. Why isn't Europe in that mix? Why isn't Europe a central player there? So again, I think Europe needs some serious introspection about what it's doing and how it's doing it. And I'm like the most sympathetic to Europe person you're going to find in this town. But I think Europe is, the not funny joke is Europe. America innovates, Europe regulates. You do not want to simply be known as the regulatory capital of the world. But that's what's happening, and I simply think that's, like I already mentioned on AI. AI is going to happen, without, and increasingly countries are not going to bend what they're doing simply to have access to the European market. It's not going to be big enough.
So you said that rightly we didn't have a big world war or superpower war, but we had a war in Europe, and that's another issue for Europe.
Yeah.
Russia invaded Ukraine,
Sure.
and we are still in the middle of it. So what is your forecast there? I mean,
Okay.
Is it giving in to Russia or find a compromise? What would you do, and what do you think Trump
Well,
would
first,
do?
what I would do is no secret, because I've been writing it in Foreign Affairs and other magazines now for almost 2.5 years. Look, we're about to mark the end of the 3rd year of this phase of the war. And all things being equal, I think Ukraine has done remarkably well. I mean, who among us would have guessed that Russia would invade, and 3 years later, Ukraine would essentially be controlling about the same amount of its territory as it controlled 3 years ago. This has been a remarkable accomplishment for Ukraine, obviously helped by Europe and the United States. This has been a remarkable accomplishment. On the other hand, they're paying an enormous human and economic and military cost for this, and it's not clear how sustainable this is. So for several years now, I have been advocating in public, originally to the dismay of many in Ukraine and elsewhere. Increasingly, though, their views have changed, that Ukraine's policy needs to essentially not simply talk about what's desirable, but also what's doable. Ukraine is not in a position to militarily liberate Crimea and all of the Donbass. That would be a great thing if they could. It's not going to happen. So what I've been advocating for years is that Ukraine needs to be open to accepting a temporary or interim ceasefire based upon current territorial division. It can keep its claims, it can pursue them down the road diplomatically, whatever, but it ought to accept a ceasefire that would stop the war, stop the carnage, allow it to rebuild. And it needs obviously guarantees of arms and needs some security assurances to do it. I think those could be forthcoming. And in the last few months, Mr. Zelensky has been indicating his willingness to do this. And so right now we have a situation where Donald Trump, who campaigned that he would get peace in 24 hours, well, he's now talking about it within 100 days or 6 months. But he now understands that the problem is not in Kyiv, the problem is in Moscow. And that's real progress. And he's talking about increasing the pressure on Vladimir Putin. And I think the Russian economy is in a bad way. I think if the price of oil goes down, the Russian economy will be in a worse way. Russia's having more and more difficulties getting the manpower it needs for this war. So I think there's a decent chance that 2025 will be the year in which there's a breakthrough diplomatically. It's somewhat optimistic, but it's not idealistic. That's not impossible. I think there's a decent chance. And I believe the biggest change is, first of all, the recognition in Ukraine that they need to accept this as an interim arrangement. And second of all, the United States and even the Trump administration are now essentially saying, we will sign on to this. We are not going to abandon Ukraine. We're not going to throw it under the bus. We're going to support it so long as it's willing to be reasonable. It is. And we're going to try to get Russia to the table. And we will pressure Russia to come to the table. We will then have a big debate about what ought to be the terms of a ceasefire. What exactly? And that's a legitimate, that's why God invented diplomats, to have that debate. But I actually think there's a pretty good chance that this spring or summer, this will be where the conversation is.
And could, as a security guarantee for Ukraine, could it be that a NATO membership would be allowed?
No, I don't see NATO membership in the cards, short of actually a formal peace. What I'm talking about is a ceasefire, not peace. I think what you could have, though, are long-term assurances of arms and probably some type of a European security commitment to Ukraine. I can imagine several European countries, Poland and several others, would be willing to do things. Look, last I checked, Russia accepted North Korean troops on its soil. That seems to me to have broken a certain taboo, and it might be quite more than possible for Ukraine to accept some European troops on its soil.
So, Middle East, Hamas is still there. Netanyahu said we have to destroy them, but he didn't manage to do that. Do you think that Hamas will still be a player, and what do you see happening also in the region? Because Iran also has had a big setback with Syria, etc., etc.
Look, the Middle East is in many ways radically changed. If we had had this lunch 6 months ago, it's possible the pasta would have been better.
Yes, by the way, sorry, we had for the first time in the history of GEI here ravioli. So then we'll run some kind of poll to see whether they were acceptable.
I don't think
or
you
not.
need to run a poll. I can guess. The Middle East has been dramatically changed. Hamas is militarily much weaker. Hezbollah has been militarily devastated. Bashar al-Assad is living in a dacha somewhere outside of Moscow. And Iran has twice attacked Israel, and twice Israel has demonstrated it can use military force against Iran with near complete freedom. That's a very different Middle East. You're right, though, Hamas, when it came out of the tunnels the other day with the ceasefire, Israel set a goal it could not achieve, which was the elimination of Hamas. It has failed. It's failed in part because it's militarily impossible to do. But even more, the only way to defeat Hamas is not simply with arms. You got to defeat them also politically. Israel has never introduced a political dimension to its strategy. What you want to do is convince Palestinians that supporting Hamas is a dead end, that it will never get you what you want, which is, greater self-government, maybe even a state one day. What the Israelis need to do is articulate some vision where Palestinians who reject Hamas but are willing to live in peace with the Jewish state, they have a chance of getting some, if not all, of what they want. Israel has refused to do that. So Hamas is the only game in town. It survived militarily. There's no competition politically. Until Israel changes that, I think Hamas will remain a player. And that's unfortunate because they're not a partner, potentially, for peace. Good news is Hezbollah is much weaker, which I think open up some possibilities for Lebanon, which is long overdue and exciting. We'll see what happens in Syria now that they're finally rid of the Assads after more than 50 years. I also have been writing and talking, I think there's a real opportunity with Iran. Iran is much weaker, and I think there is, not just militarily, its proxies are weaker and its economy is a shambles. Economy is in terrible shape. And I believe that there's an opportunity for diplomacy, where if the United States goes to Iran and say, here's what we want with your nuclear program, here's what we want when it comes to your reducing or stopping support for your proxies, in return we won't attack you, and in return we'll relieve some of the economic sanctions and reduce the pressure on you. I think there's a possibility for that deal.
And do you see the Abraham agreements extended to Saudi Arabia at a certain point, or how long will it take?
It'll only be extended, I believe. Saudi Arabia wants.
Because they were about to do it, no? So
they were about to do it, in large part because Saudi Arabia wants a security commitment from the United States, a guarantee against Iran, and they want some help with their nuclear research and development. Originally, it was the United States that introduced the requirement that also that basically something be done for the Palestinians as part of the package. That Israel would have to do something there. Saudis didn't initially care much, but after October 7th, and more important, after the last 15, 16 months, the Saudis care about it. Public opinion in Saudi Arabia and the Arab world has shifted. The younger generation has discovered the Palestinian cause. So the question is now, can or will Israel say certain things or commit to certain things that give the Saudis enough cover, to put it bluntly, to normalize relations with Israel? I don't know. What Mr. Trump said the other day, what President Trump said the other day was not helpful. The idea that let's clean out Gaza and have 1.5 million Palestinians move to Egypt and Jordan, that will not check the box for the Saudis or anybody else. So I think there's a real question of whether this administration is going to be willing to lean on Israel to produce enough in the way of a commitment that the Saudis can normalize with Israel. I think they might, in part because the Abraham Accords are something that Mr. Trump is associated with from his first term. So I'm hoping that he is willing to use some of his leverage with the Israelis. He clearly used some to get this hostage agreement signed. He's done some other things since then that I've been critical of, including the statement on transfer, including rescinding all the sanctions against settlers who've done violent acts against Palestinians. But we'll see. If this administration wants to, quote unquote, encourage, I will be a diplomat here, Israel to be more forthcoming with the Palestinians, I think they are in a very strong position.
Okay, so Trump, the first week, we've seen him in action, and everything that was supposed to happen happened. Hundreds of executive orders. Greenland can be even conquered by military. Who knows? We'll see. And Colombia backed down. After Trump imposed tariffs, immigration, and so on and so forth. So, what is your general take? Because many things happen, so it's hard to pinpoint to one.
Yeah, it's exhausting. I mean, here it is. We're now what, 8? Today is what, Tuesday? So we're 8 days or so, 9 days into the new administration. Feels like 8 or 9 months. The pace has been extraordinary. Look, there's been, when you win an election, you have options to do things. Elections have consequences. We've seen that. Some of the things were predictable. Some are positive, some are negative, I would say. I was disappointed that, I wasn't surprised there were pardons for the January 6th people who were arrested, tried, and imprisoned. I was quite frankly surprised that the pardons included those who had used force, physical force against law enforcement. I think that was both unexpected and regrettable that happened, and more important, so does some, even some Republican senators are saying this, the same thing. I don't understand why we had to put a pause on all foreign aid. We could have kept it in place. We could have reviewed every program over the next 90 days and then revised or ended those programs that people found fault with. Wasn't necessary to stop, for example, the PEPFAR program, which has probably saved, 25 million lives over the last 20 years with HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment. A lot of the food programs, some of the arms programs. I just don't understand why there's this across-the-board approach there. The thing with Colombia was heavy-handed. In the short run, again, just to be clear, we have been deporting people by aircraft to Colombia for years. What was different this time was it was military aircraft, and some of the people were handcuffed. This was worked out. I think it'll be seen as a victory for Mr. Trump for having threatened tariffs and been quote-unquote tough. The issue, though, is whether over the long run this changes the perception of the United States and the willingness of some countries to trade and invest and be dependent on the United States, because it shows that with that dependency comes vulnerability. So I think a lot of countries will take note. I expect the Chinese are pretty happy that this provides some opportunities for them. And in some other cases, tariffs will cause retaliation. I think the biggest threat to the Trump administration over its first year could well be renewed inflation. And if you add up tax cuts, you add up regulatory cuts, you add up tariffs and the response to tariffs, you add up immigration, the tightening of the labor force, well, all that suggests inflationary pressures. And it'll make it, I think, extremely difficult for the U.S. Federal Reserve to cut rates. Indeed, I think it's, I said I wouldn't try to predict the future. I don't think it's inconceivable that at some point the debate will be less about cutting rates and whether we have to adjust them upwards. I think that is not inconceivable. If all these things come to pass, that will not be something that this administration would welcome, and then we potentially have a real, shall we say, clash between the Federal Reserve Board and the White House. But if there is a vulnerability to the administration, I would think that if you add up all the things they're doing, it could contribute to inflationary pressures just at a time that inflation has been pretty much under control.
So last night, the Republican meeting in Florida, in fact nearby Mar-a-Lago, I think, he gave some.
I think it was at the Doral.
Yeah, Doral, but anyway, I think the Trump Hotel was used for.
Yeah.
But so he mentioned.
It's not a great golf course, by the way.
But he mentioned.
Just kidding, though.
He's mentioned that he may consider maybe another mandate. Trump said, why not maybe another 4 years after these 4 years? So, when he starts to say things like this, we should worry, because usually he just says them and then is technically possible, or not?
No, you need a constitutional amendment. It wouldn't happen. So there's no way it could happen within the confines of the Constitution. So no, I don't see it happening. What I see, and again, you can drive yourself crazy trying to almost, it's like interpreting what Mr. Trump means, but he puts a lot out there, and sometimes it's just what some people would call opening bids. Sometimes it's leveraging. He may want people to think it's a possibility. Let me put it this way: when you're in your second term as a president, you're by definition a lame duck. And I'd expect there's people around Mr. Trump would say that's not good, particularly after the midterm elections in November of next year. People begin to discount you a little bit. It's not a personal thing. It's what happens to every second-term president. So they may say, put this out there. This is a way that it raises questions about the future. I don't know. I'm just guessing. But I don't see any chance Mr. Trump would get to serve a third term.
So I have a last question, and then I open up for a couple of questions from the public, from all of you. We have a very short time, but my last question is about Meloni, Giorgia Meloni.
You could probably answer it better.
Well, but do you think that she could, in fact, be a bridge between Trump and Europe, and that she can have? What is your perception from an American?
No, absolutely. In order to be a bridge, you need connections in both directions. Yeah, I would think, I wasn't there, but it seems that her visit to Mar-a-Lago went well. The fact that she was invited seemed to have gone well. She's clearly seen as something of a kindred spirit. And you'd be in a better position than I would to assess the quality and strength of her relations with her European colleagues, France, Britain, Germany, what have you. But yeah, traditionally it was the UK that was the bridge. I don't see how the UK can be the bridge, in part because of Brexit, which is one of the single worst ideas to have ever been invented by any government. And second of all, that the Brits have gone to the left at the time most other places are moving more to the right. So I'm not saying that's good or bad, but it makes it very hard for the British to be a bridge. So I think the question of who's going to be the bridge to Europe, or between the Americans and the Europeans, I think that position is open, and I think Italy is in as good a position as anybody to fill it. Regulating AI more is not the answer. Again, I talked before, but I think Europe needs to read a more important take to heart the Draghi report. It needs to have a little bit of soul searching. Why has Europe gotten to where it is? And by the way, look at the domestic political consequences of low, no growth Europe. It's pushing Europe dramatically to the right. And you may welcome that, but maybe not. When I see the AfD in Germany as strong as it does not fill me with comfort. So I think Europe is paying not just an international price, but also a European price in terms of the domestic politics. So I think Europe needs soul searching, and then it needs almost a new definition of the center left or the center right, of the center. Whether it's Schmerz in Merz in Germany, or centrists in France or any country. But the far right's going to be there. You need an alternative to the far right, but it can't be the far left. That is dead. So Europe needs to find again, there's a big space there from center right to center left. That space needs to be filled. And at the moment, it's too empty. And I forgot your first question, and I apologize.
China and Africa.
Oh yeah. Look, one of the problems is, we are going to be creating spaces. The kind of thing we just did with Colombia, the kind of thing we did with the aid freeze, the pause. Some people will get nervous when China starts making inroads, and that might be something of a motive, that we're creating opportunities for China, we're hurting ourselves, we're helping them. And maybe that'll motivate some people, I don't know. But that will be one of the effects, for sure.
I want to go back to your view on Ukraine. On the one hand, you correctly mentioned that the peace we've enjoyed and the growth in standards of living after the Second World War was based, among others, on the concepts that borders couldn't be changed by force. Aren't you really accepting what has been, the opposite of one of the tenets of the last 80 years, and especially, doesn't that provide a template for China and Taiwan? Thank you.
I can now say a little bit more. No one would accept that borders have been changed by force. This would be an interim, temporary, whatever word you want to use, ceasefire. Ultimately, you'd want to negotiate peace. And I think that will never happen with Vladimir Putin. You may have to wait for his successor or his successor's successor. And that's why you'd want to keep some sanctions in place to give Russia incentive to one day negotiate. You'd want to keep reparations demands in place to incentive. Ultimately, you'd want to also have some positives. It may be that Ukraine could enter NATO, but NATO forces wouldn't be stationed in Ukraine. I can think of lots of ways to structure a long-term peace. But no, I don't think Ukraine should be pressured at all to give up its claims. I also wouldn't ask Russia to give up its claims to get a ceasefire. Mr. Putin has his dreams about Ukraine that he wrote in the summer before he invaded. He can keep his dreams, but he's never, I would say he never should be able to formalize them. One day there'll be a negotiation between Ukraine and Russia where all these issues will be out there, and I expect there'll be territorial transfers, probably some degrees of autonomy for various citizens and so forth. I think there's a deal to be had. But again, if you say we can't have even a ceasefire because Russia is occupying Ukraine territory, well, the consequences of that are open-ended war, and Ukraine will lose. So, with all due respect, the so-called friends of Ukraine who insist on this pure position, I think are actually not doing Ukraine any good.
Thank you.
China and Taiwan.
Look, China, I think, has been sobered a little bit by this, about how the West has acted, the sanctions and so forth. But that's up to us. We have to we'll never get China to give up its dreams on Taiwan. What we have to do is persuade Xi Jinping that acting on those dreams, trying to turn them into reality, will be extraordinarily expensive and risky for him and for the party and for China. That's on us. So I think we've shown that what Russia tried has been incredibly costly for Russia. And by the way, Xi Jinping must some days wonder how good his army is after seeing how Russia's performed. But the main thing, it's on us. We have got to, deterrence depends upon two things. One is your strength, and the other is your perceived willingness to use your strength. It is on us to make sure we have the strength and that China perceives that we are credible when we threaten to use it. That's why years ago I advocated that we should say we would come to Taiwan's defense if China attacked. Get rid of the ambiguity. We should also say, I think, we would support Taiwan's independence if China attacked. What I want to do is say, look, we are committed to the status quo, we're against independence, we believe in one China, but if China uses force against Taiwan, then it again risks outcomes that would be, it very much does not want to see.
So I wanted to ask you about the Democratic Party. The American Democratic Party. So what lessons do you hope they learn? And do you think that they will go more towards a closeness on issues like immigration? What do you expect?
Right now, the Democrats, how would I put it? They're almost missing in action. I mean, you turn on TV, you go on social media, and it's all Trump all the time. And since this lunch began, there's probably 5 more executive orders. I mean, there's a sense of just a flurry of activity. And the Democrats are almost nowhere to be seen. Almost nowhere to be seen. And what matters in all these confirmations are not Democrats. It's whether you can find 4 Republicans to oppose them. So Democrats almost seem irrelevant. So the question is, how do they get relevant? And I would say it's ultimately, in the short run, they should oppose those policies they disagree with. They should not oppose policies just because the Trump administration is doing them. They've got to be selective. But they've ultimately got to redefine who they are. I think they are out of touch with a lot of America. The border issues, they are badly out of touch with. I think the woke issues, they're out of touch. I think they've got other problems. The Democrats are beholden, not just to unions, but to certain unions in particular, the teachers' unions. Look at the city. New York now has the distinction. We spend more per pupil on education than any other state. The last I checked, our educational outcomes do not reflect it. Okay, we got a problem with the Democrats. If the Democrats want to stand for equal opportunity, how can they continue to support the teachers' unions and the state of New York's public schools? So the Democrats have to decide. Now, they're going to have problems. I get it. If they start trying to redefine themselves, powerful parts of the Democratic Party will not agree. In particular, the Democratic Party, like all political parties, is a coalition. And there's elements of the so-called progressive left that will disagree. I think if the progressive left continues to dominate, the Democrats will be in opposition for a long, long time. So I think the Democrats have to reclaim the center. That will probably mean making parts of the progressive left unhappy and you're going to lose some of them, and the only way you can then win an election is replace them with people on the center. I think the Democrats have to go down that path. I don't know if they will, but if they don't, I think they will be probably in opposition for some time to come. But I think there's a real moment, shall we say, of reckoning for Democrats, because they've lost the Senate, they've lost the House. They'll probably, but not definitely, win the House in 2 years. I don't think there's any chance they win back the Senate. It's way too soon to start talking about 2028. We just got through an election. But I think the Democrats have to get serious. The analogy in history is after the loss of McGovern, the Democrats invented something called the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Council. Ultimately, they redefined their message, made it more centrist, and they found a messenger, and his name was Bill Clinton. I think they need to do something similar now. They need to redefine their message, move to the center, and then I think they'll have any number of messengers. The real question, though, is can they make that move? And I simply don't know.
Thank you, Richard Haass. Please, thank you, George.